I was interrupted by the rustling of a portiere behind, and turning, I saw a vision of loveliness that drove the whole subject from my mind, and so confused me that as I rose to be introduced, I hesitated and stammered like a schoolboy. There, framed by the arched doorway, with one hand raised to push aside the portiere, was a picture to rattle the most stolid and indifferent son of Adam. You see how naturally I fall back into the American vernacular. Tall, fair, with a wealth of golden brown hair coiled like a turban on the crown of a magnificently poised head, I beheld standing before me the most splendid woman that I had ever gazed upon. Large brown eyes beaming with intelligence, milk-white forehead, broad and low, a firm mouth exquisitely chiseled with a full ruby lips, a well-rounded chin, strong but relieved by most charming dimple, perfect teeth and snow white. As I observed when she smiled a most gracious welcome, such was Helen Morris, the daughter of the house, as she appeared to me the first time. I had always been proud of America's beautiful women, of whom I had known many, but never before had I looked upon a woman that so impressed, or should I rather say, overwhelmed me. She was richly attired in the evening dress of that country which heightened the charm of her queenly face and figure. She wore a close-fitting bodice of light blue silk that displayed to perfection the exquisitely rounded bust and well-formed waist, and extended just high enough to be caught with a pearl shell ornament like an epaulet over the shoulders. Above this was set a rich lace collar or yoke of a delicate peach blow tint, which served to emphasize the whiteness of the alabaster throat. Close-fitting sleeves of the same stuff revealed, rather than hid, the beautifully molded shoulders, arms, ending with large ruffles at the wrists. Around the waist was belted a skirt of seal brown velvet extending halfway to the knees, and under this was a worn close-fitting knitted garment of dove-colored silk that terminated in seal-colored buskins fastened with the light blue pearl buttons around the shapely ankle. She stood like a beautiful prima donna before the footlights in full stage costume. Every perfection of form and feature was displayed to the greatest possible advantage, and as she advanced with natural and unstudied grace, I could not but remark how much more beautiful God's most exquisite creation appeared in this garb than in the starched and stilted skirts as I had been accustomed to seeing them all my life. She also greeted me cordially, and though too polite to appear to notice it, with a sweeping glance she took in my costume, and I imagined that I could detect a smile lurking the corners of her mouth. To a person who had never before seen a man attired in baggy-legged trousers that dragged the floor and high-glazed collar that cut the chin, I no doubt presented quite a ludicrous appearance. As I contrasted myself with her father, gracefully dressed in the old English fashion of knee breeches and ruffles, I could not but perceive that it was to my disadvantage. After the exchange of a few pleasant civilities, in which I was as much charmed with the music of her voice as I had been with the beauty of her person, she announced that the evening meal was waiting, and taking her father's arm, led the way to the dining room, leaving me to escort Miss Morris, or rather to be escorted by her. The dining room, or kitchen, for it was all one, was a cozy room with polished stone floor, and at one end was what appeared to be a low enameled sideboard, although I found when the meal was served that it was an electric furnace from which the different dishes were taken and set upon the marble-topped table. Everything was served from the dish in which it was cooked, and I learned for the first time that culinary operations could be carried on without soot or smoke. The cooking vessels were set upon paper mats, and under each plate was spread a snow-white paper napkin, while another, neatly folded, lay beside it. At the risk of being tiresome, I'm going to thus minutely into these details, my object being to give as clearly as possible an insight into the way these people live. It is worth hope, too, that the overworked American women whose lives are one long martyrdom to the washtub, the dishpan, and the ironing table, may profit by the simpler and cleanlier customs of a more advanced people. Knowing what American customs were, my host remarked to me that there was enough necessary labor in the Iron Republic to keep everybody employed, and so no unnecessary labor was indulged in. No tablecloths or napkins were laundered, the paper ones used being fully as good and so cheap that the cost was a mere nothing. Even these, after being used, were packed in a hamper and exchanged for new ones at half the original cost. They were chemically cleansed and went into a pulp agent at the factory, and so were used over and over. So this would sort of be like recycling, I guess. The professor, by the way, I think that would be many decades before we actually acknowledge doing it, but I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on recycling, but the professor and his wife sat opposite to each other at the table, which placed me vis-a-vis to the charming daughter. I had been accustomed to social functions of every description, and no Beau Brummel was ever more at home at a fashionable dinner party than I. But with this beautiful woman directly in front of me, her radiant face only a few feet from mine, and our knees almost touching under the table, I was awkward as a country bumpkin at a Lord Mayor's banquet. They were all kind enough, I think, to attribute this to the strangeness of my surroundings, and in most gracious ways strove to relieve me of my embarrassment and make me feel at home. During the meal hour, which was a most delightful one, we talked about American customs, and then the conversation turned upon American art and literature in comparison with that of the Iron Republic. In the discussion which followed, I was pitted against the ladies, my host remarking that he was a citizen of both countries, he should be equally proud of the achievements of each. I dilated on our poets, essayists, and novelists, and lauded the achievements of our architects and painters, but whether it was the superior numbers of the enemy or superior strategic ability, my native country was made to appear as far behind in these as in the more practical arts of life. The best of the old English writers were not unknown to them, as Professor Morris carried a well-stocked library in the vessel that bore him to his adopted country. Emerson, Longfellow, Whittier, and many other American writers they were also familiar with, as the professor had brought their earlier works to the country, and all had been republished and put through many editions. Finally, turning to my host, I said banteringly, "Professor, if your relations to both countries disqualifies you for participating in this discussion or taking sides, it ought to fit you all the better to act as referee between us. You are familiar with what is best in both countries, and to your judgment I am willing to defer. Now, upon the lines we have been debating, which country, in your opinion, is entitled to take precedence?" "This," said the professor, after a moment's hesitation, "is a difficult question to answer. To institute a comparison of this kind is like comparing one part of the firmament to the other. Every nation has produced its great men, men who were brilliant in different ways. One part of the firmament has stars as bright as any other part. The human mind has its limitations, and probably some men of every race have risen to the limit of human achievement in some things. But while all parts of the firmament may contain bright stars, as bright as the brightest, looking at the sidereal heavens, you will observe that one part, taken all together, is more luminous than another, that is to say, has more bright stars. And so, passing judgment on both countries as a whole, I am compelled to say that the Iron Republic has surpassed America or any other nation. America has produced one Longfellow, the Iron Republic many. An essayist like Emerson towers above you like a monarch of the forest. Here, they are as the leaves in Vallambrosia's shade. You had one Beecher. Here, his name is Legion. And so, in every field where the human mind has blazed a shining way, I will not say that in America the highway of genius is less exalted, but it is less traveled. But why should that be so? I asked, unwilling to yield the point, when both nations came from the same parent stock and developed under practically the same climatic conditions. My dear sir, replied the professor with a smile, that question is easily answered. Admitting the intellectual equality of the two nations, there is every reason why this should excel in every field of human effort, except that of bold and cunning acquisitions. The construction of your government, and indeed all of the governments of the world, of the old world, is such as to encourage the prostitution of great talents to selfish personal aggrandizement. The genius which has made your thousands of great politicians and financiers would have made the same great men, or many of them, with a more unselfish and enduring greatness in this country. Here, Henry Clay or Daniel Webster would never have devoted an hour of time or an iota of talent to the trade of politics, for neither, by taking thought, could have added a cubit to his political stature. The genius that has built up million-dollar fortunes in your country here would have lain dormant or been more unselfishly applied. What I mean to say is that in this country great talents can only find expression in the fields of art, literature, philosophy, and science, while in your country they may be applied to stock jobbing, financial exploitation, and the trade of politics. All these fields invite talents of the highest order and yield returns more gratifying to our selfish instincts. Do I understand that talent counts for nothing here in the race for wealth or political preferment? I asked with astonishment. Well, it counts for little in the race for wealth and absolutely nothing in the race for political preferment, answered my host. The consequence is that ambition, to be gratified, must be in a measure of unselfish, and genius must expand and soar in a noble field or remain dormant. You cannot hope to grasp the results of a century of intelligent government building in a few minutes, but you will understand when you have had time for observation, he continued as we left the table. On our return to the sitting room, my host excused himself, saying that he had some business affairs to look after which would detain him the better part of the evening. Almost immediately afterwards, Mrs. Morris also excused herself on the plea of having to look after the affairs of her kitchen, for it appeared that although in affluent circumstances, they kept no servants. This left me alone with the daughter, and for a few moments we sat in rather embarrassing silence. The glorious beauty of this woman, her great lustrous brown eyes that seemed to irradiate everything they looked upon, the striking and brilliant costume that revealed so perfectly every charm of her graceful form, made the whole seem to me like a scene in the Arabian Nights, in which I was bewitched and transported from the realm of sober reality into the magical presence of some wonderful princess. She relieved the situation by rising and asking me if I would not like to hear the news of the day, approaching the contrivance over the mantel from which had issued the music before supper. "You will probably hear a good deal about yourself," she said, smiling archly, as she proceeded to adjust the bell-shaped transmitter. Chapter 4, The Iron Republic by Richard Jameson Morgan. Then, by all means, let us dispense with the news, I pleaded with unfeigned earnestness. How would you like to be entertained, then? She asked, turning to me. You can have an opera, lecture, or anything that's going on in the city. Perhaps you'd like some music. The National Orchestra plays this evening in the Capitol, and you can have the full program or any part of it. I dearly love music, I replied, and what I've heard in this country has been remarkably fine, but swelling from mysterious tubes or bursting from great mechanical contrivances imparts a weirdness to it that serves to heighten the unreality of my present position and surroundings. Do you know, I said with sincerity that made her burst out laughing, that I have pinched myself a great many times since I reached these shores in the endeavor to awaken. Even now, it would be no surprise to me to start and wake and yawn and open my eyes to find myself back in America and my wonderful experience of the past year a dream. I dare say you would be highly gratified to awake at this very moment, she said with just a shade of reproach in her voice. Oh, no, indeed, I cried with an impetuosity that altogether out of keeping with the shortness of our acquaintance, at the same time rising hastily and approaching to where she stood by the mantel. I would not wake now for worlds. If it be, I said, repeating a fragment from one of her own poets that she had quoted at the table, if it be then that the seeming has more of beauty than the real, if only it be in dreaming, I may find the land o' leal. May I not continue dreaming, were it not cruel to wake again? Is not bliss, even in the seeming, preferable to real pain? A blush overspread her face, making it even more beautiful than before, and I too flushed, feeling that I had gone too far for a rank stranger, as it were, from another world. Very well, she responded, I would much dislike to wake you as long as your dream is pleasant. Nevertheless, she added with a meaning glance, I shall reserve the privilege of dashing cold water on you whenever I deem it proper to rouse you to a consciousness of your real position. And turning, she walked over to the music stand and began to handle the sheets of music. This Parthenon shot sobered me, and I begged her to remember the peculiarity of my situation, being as absolutely cut off from every female acquaintance on earth as if I had landed on another planet. Knowing only her mother and herself, and meeting them as the wife and daughter of a countryman, I begged pardon if, like the lonely emigrant who meets a compatriot in a strange land, I presumed too much on short acquaintance. My words or manner evidently convinced her of my sincerity, for turning and advancing with a world of sympathy in her beautiful eyes, she extended her hand with the most frank cordiality, and as I grasped her fingertips, almost daring to raise them to my lips, she assured me that her love and admiration for her father made it quite impossible for any countryman of his to be a stranger, and begged me to consider her an old friend. The touch of her hand made my blood tingle, and the sweet candor of her manner made me feel quite at home again. What I was going to remark, I resumed, was that the mysterious and automatic manner in which this music, news, and other entertaining things you suggest comes to us heightens the unreality of my surroundings, and what I desired to make everything seem more real and less like an illusion was something to remind me of home and life as I had been accustomed to it. This, I presume, is a musical instrument, said I, advancing to the piano, and if you will be kind enough to play something yourself, I will enjoy it more than all the orchestras in the world, or over a wire or through a tube. Without a moment's hesitation, she complied, and sitting down to the instrument, she played several pieces with great skill and expression. Noticing a number of songs among the music, I asked her if she would sing. She consented, but asked me to waive my objections to the automatic and mysterious tube, as she preferred a violin obbligato to playing her own accompaniment. Selecting a piece of music, she approached the general utility telephone and, pressing a button, asked somebody somewhere for the obbligato to the song, giving the title. In a moment, soft and low, like the sighing melody of an Aeolian harp, came the prelude to the accompaniment, and then in a voice full, round, and sweet, she rendered the song, the obbligato, swelling and sinking and blending with the rich tones of her cultivated voice, as though it were played by a master in the very room where we stood. Mrs. Morris entered the room while she was singing, and when the song was finished, at the request of her daughter, joined with her in a duet, her fine contralto voice blending beautifully with the other's soprano. At its conclusion, I was asked for an American song, and as a fairly good baritone voice was the one single accomplishment I had been proud of at home, I compiled and sang "Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep," while Miss Morris played an accompaniment. I acquitted myself quite creditably, and was gratified when they both admitted that no finer song had been composed in the Iron Republic. When Mrs. Morris reappeared after dinner, she too was attired in an evening dress made similar to her daughter's, though somewhat plainer, of some pearl gray stuff that was extremely becoming. Upon my risking a cautious compliment on her appearance, the conversation turned on the subject of dress, and I soon became aware that woman is woman the world over, be the surroundings what they may. I described to them the latest modes of dress in my country, and then there was the inevitable comparison between the different styles of the two countries. When I ventured a rough guess at the number of articles of apparel and adornment one of our fashionable ladies would wear at one time, they threw up their hands in horror and wondered how they had time for anything else but to dress and undress. I expressed my decided preference for the Ironian style as illustrated by their charming costumes, but told them frankly that it would not be tolerated in my country. "And pray what would be the objections to it?" asked my hostess. "Well, to be perfectly honest and plain with you, madame," I replied, "it would be considered that is, immodest." "But why?" Because, my dear madame, that is to say, I am delighted at myself, and can conceive nothing more becoming," I stammered. "I'm very glad," said Mrs. Morris, "but why should this style of dress be considered immodest in your country?" Because, madame, if you were to have it," I answered under protest, "it admits of too much exposure of the person. Then, in the world you came from, one object of woman in dressing is to conceal the beauty of form which nature has bestowed upon them." "Yes, madame, that is, it seems so." "Modest ladies, attired as we are, in a drawing-room would blush and be embarrassed?" "Oh, most undoubtedly, madame, at first." "And yet on the stage, where the most beautiful and artistic effects are aimed at, this style of dress is employed?" "Well, that is true, madame. It is also true that at the bathing resorts, where the sexes are thrown into the closest juxtaposition, only the rudiments of even the Ironian style are worn. Now, I will ask you candidly, Mr. Barrington, can you conceive of any more reason why the female form, which artists insist is the most perfect work of creation, should be disguised or concealed than there is that the symmetrical proportions of a horse should be hidden under skirts, or a beautiful statue covered from the head down with a blanket?" Smiling at the forceful illustration of my hostess, I replied that I could not, though if crooked-leg horses and thin-shanked imperfect statuettes could influence the fashion, even horses and statues might wear clothes. "No doubt of it," exclaimed my hostess, "and I seem to remember one of good old Aesop's fables about a fox who was unfortunate in the manner of his caudal appendage." May it not be too, she continued, that the fashion of concealment owes its origin to sentiments and feelings exactly the reverse of modesty? Is, after all, the revelation of such beauty as the female figure possesses any more suggestive than its concealment when such beauty is known to exist under the disguise? Indeed, she went on, warming up to the subject, the commissioners excluded a most beautiful statue from one of our parks because the indecent suggestion of the drapery. Here we wear 3 or 4 garments and combine comfort, beauty, grace, and utility. In your country, women wear a dozen or more, and the most complimentary thing I can say of them, after studying their pictures, is that some are not as ugly as others. I'll dare say if Eve had come forth from the shady bowers of Eden and had met her lord and master dressed in the modern American fashion, the poor man would have scaled the fence and left the garden of his own accord. I laughed heartily at this, Sally, and looking slyly at me, Miss Morris observed that her mother must have some good reason for feeling so strongly on the subject. "Oh, I make no secret of it," retorted her mother good-humoredly. "I once prevailed on by Professor Morris to array myself in all the glory of the American fashion as it prevailed when he left there, and appeared in public full-rigged, hoop skirt and all. Ugh! It makes my cheeks burn yet to think of it. Seeing a crowd beginning to follow us, I ran into a house and begged the lady for the love of heaven to hide me while my husband called a carriage. I was taken home in hysterics, and literally tearing the flounces and frames from my person, I held them over a flame until the last shred fell into ashes. That is, all but the wire in the hoop skirt, that the professor buried with it the last hope of making an American woman of me. It was weeks before I could muster courage to go on the streets again. Since then, my husband has admitted that his preference for American dress only extended to me, and that, for all other women, he thought the style of the country much prettier and more desirable. "Ah, well, he's gotten over all that now," she concluded, "as you will in time." I assured her that I was already well over it, and in the matter of female dress, if nothing else, I was an iron Republican to the core. Professor Morris arrived in the midst of a general laugh and remarked pleasantly that it did not appear that I was being ostracized as an alien. He then informed us that he had learned while out that there would be an especial attraction at the Capitol that evening, in the person of Madame Shafton, who was to sing her latest song, and he asked an usher from his office to connect us when her turn came. Madame Shafton, I was told, was considered the finest singer in the Republic, and a composer of rare merit besides. Indeed, I was informed that in musical circles it was hardly considered good form for a person to play or sing anything except their own compositions, the exceptions being in the case only of music of extraordinary merit. In the midst of a general conversation, some 10 minutes afterwards, a sudden hum of voices penetrated the room from the transmitter, and then clearly and distinctly came the words, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to bring forward one who is known and honored from one end of the Republic to the other, and who has always been a deserved favorite at the Capitol." Then, during the applause which followed, very much in the American fashion, Miss Morris ran to the transmitter and, pulling out certain stops, drew what appeared to be a ground glass screen before it. At the same time, she turned off the lights, leaving us in the dark except for a pale light which illuminated the screen from the transmitter.